Hey everyone, it is George Couros, and this is a special episode of the Innovator's Mindset podcast. First of all, I'm trying to record a little bit more outside, trying to get just outside more. It's really good for my mental health, and it's kind of a neat way to kind of see a different aspect. I know you typically get the nice background and all that other stuff, but I just wanted to just do a little bit of an intro just to tell you why this podcast is a little bit unique. I sat down with Wotruba. He is the executive director at the Michigan Association of School Boards, and we had a conversation. I'm about to keynote their conference coming up in the next couple months, and so he wanted to talk about innovation in education, a little bit about artificial intelligence and why it matters, but really focusing on how we as educational leaders, administrators, school board trustees, how we can actually really help our communities to lead this charge without actually foregoing the basics, without actually ignoring some of the really fundamental things that we need to do that are not just focused on literacy and numeracy, but also really developing character in our students. So I just wanted to introduce this to you because it's more of an interview of me, but we cross-posted this just to save some time. I get a podcast, they get a podcast. So I hope you enjoy this. Welcome to another episode of the Innovator's Mindset podcast featuring me. Have a good day.
One of the things that seems to be on the forefront of minds for school districts, we're hearing about it, and is that conversation about how do we change education? How do we innovate? What does that look like? And I know a lot of people, and we've done podcasts on AI, and that's not what I'm talking about. It's really the innovation of how we do education, the innovation of learning. How do we do that differently and better to improve the results, to help the kids that we're all here to help? That is something that we're hearing from a lot of people, and we're hearing it in a criticism too, that we don't do it enough in education. And so I really want to spend some time digging into that topic. Luckily for us, one of our speakers at the annual conference this year brings an expertise in innovation work, and we want to be able to share with our members that. And we're fortunate enough to have that speaker on the podcast today. And with me today, George Couros, innovation and leadership consultant, author, blogger, podcaster, and ALC speaker for us this year. George, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, I am really excited to join here today. I really appreciate the conversation we had before. It's always good to get to know you. And, I was saying before we started recording, I have a special affinity for Michigan because I grew up in Canada. And a lot of times when people hear that, you think you're, on the border of Michigan, but I was actually on the western side of Canada. But for whatever reason, all the American channels that we had were Detroit channels and WDIV. I grew up with Carmen Harlan, Bernie Smilovitz. So it's just I knew so much about Michigan growing up for whatever reason. So I'm really excited to be there. I know it's just a wonderful group. It's one of the states that's actually north of Canada, which is kind of neat. So I'm really excited to work with you all and, really dive into that notion of innovation that you discussed at the beginning.
And I appreciate, I can pick up still a little bit of your Canadian accent. And so, I might slip into my Yooper accent by the time we're 30 minutes into this. It'll be hard for me to, quit saying A's. So appreciate the time that you're on here. I said it to George when we were in the lead up to this as well. I was looking and listening a little bit to his podcast. And so I was a challenge as a host, oh, am I doing it right? Are we doing it well? Whenever we have somebody that's skilled at doing this, and clearly George is. So I would also encourage people as we get ready for conference, or if you're not able to make it to conference, Google George and find his website and listen to some of his podcasts. He has a ton of information out there and also some great blog posts too. So,
it's actually interesting, and I'm trying to change my language just a little bit too. I just was in the state of Washington, and I did a keynote there. And the person who booked me for this event was not an educator. She had never heard of me before, and we're talking prior to planning for this. I said, "How did you find me? How do you even know about me?" And she said she went on to ChatGPT and she said, hey, here's our vision and what we're trying to do. And actually, I said, who would be a good speaker? And your name came up first, and it gave me a list of reasons. So it's like now it's kind of weird because now we're not even like people are not even finding you through Google. They're actually going through like AI searches, and it's like a different type of result because you can tailor it, like saying like, hey, this is what we're trying to do. Here's our mission and vision. Here, you know, who would be a good person to kind of bring in, and that's how my name came out to them. So like I even brought it. I was just there. It was mind blowing to me because you know it's the same thing like. What's the language after this, right? Are we going to say like start chat GPTing people?
Yeah, right.
Like, I don't know what we say after this, but it is kind of how that's progressing. And that's actually one of the things I talk about with a lot of organizations. How do you actually set up your students where they aren't just being Googled, but you know that they're seen as experts and they have you know content out there, and it's where opportunities. And I think this is the shift that they are not just be Googled when an opportunity presents itself, but opportunities are finding them, which it did for me, which is kind of an interesting thing. Because a lot of things I talk about are from my experience, not from me researching it and not actually doing it. It is talking about this like, hey, this happened to me. How do we actually elevate this and give students the same opportunity that I had working with this district, finding me through an AI search?
Yeah, and I have started moving that way. And one of the things, you know, I was talking to some folks just last week, and Phil, our videographer, who's putting together the podcast, like we were talking in the car about ChatGPT, and I had just upgraded to the paid subscription so I can start doing voice, so I can start talking with it rather than writing because I spend a lot of time in the car. And so after he had left the vehicle, because it's a little weird when you have somebody in the vehicle with you to have that conversation. But like I was asking ChatGPT questions about certain like things that I needed to know. And so I was not Googling anymore. I was like going back and forth with the GPT. So it's interesting. And I had read the piece on Googling and that kind of perspective of kids and getting to know what that looks like. And so I didn't even have it down in my notes, but I will actually probably start off with that after I first say, tell the listeners about yourself. Like, how did you get to be a speaker on innovation? And I know you've been in Michigan before with other organizations, but tell us a little bit about your journey to where you're at.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I actually had no interest in going into education. That was never kind of my field. It was basically, I know that sounds weird. I actually saw Billy Madison. I'm like, that looks really interesting to be around kids all day. I'm not even kidding about it. I wish I was joking, but I was like, yeah, that seems like something I could, you know, be around kids. You know, I have a, you know, kind of a youthful attitude towards life. And yeah, and then I basically taught at every level, became a vice principal, which was kind of a shock. It wasn't really an aspirational thing for me at the time. Principal soon after that. And then I worked in central office, and my work in central office, I was actually asked to join the central office team to really kind of work with leadership on focusing on innovation and to kind of replicate some of the things that we were doing in our schools. Not like, hey, we want you to do this exact thing, but how do you think differently about how you actually, you know, approach your work when you're talking about innovation? It's not just like a lot of people associate with technology, but I just kind of define as doing new and better things. So it's really like, how do we create professional learning that's, you know, much more not only engaging, but empowering for people where they feel they're walking out with something that is very tailored and specific to them that is beneficial to their context and their community. And when I got to that role, I was called it was like going to be the division principal of educational technology. And I didn't like the title, and I pushed back on it a little bit, which is kind of my nature. And the reason why is because I know that if you have technology in your title, that no matter what the focus is, as soon as people hear it, they're like, can you fix my computer? Like, it is totally fix my stuff. So I didn't want to focus on that. So I actually worked with my superintendent, and we came up with this title, Division Principal of Innovative Teaching and Learning. And so it was like really a good title, but no one knew what it meant. So we're like, what does this even mean when we say this? And at the time, if you look at, I think this is probably around 2009 or 2010, nobody had innovation in their title in a school district. That was not a focus. So it's this new thing. So part of my work was like, what does this even mean? What does this mean? What does this look like? And how do we get people there? And so that is kind of how I progressed to this, but how I became a speaker, which is really fascinating to me, was I was just sharing stuff we were doing in our school, just to kind of connect with community, connect with families, and educators, to show like, hey, this is what we're doing in our school. Please feel free to modify this to your community. And then all of a sudden, people started saying like, hey, we love your work. Would you be willing to speak for our organization? I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, I didn't even know it was a job, to be honest. Yeah. And then I'm like, I guess I could. And then they're like, hey, what's your fee? I'm like, you're gonna pay me? This is a job. And so then, yeah, it just was organic. It was never like, I want to be a speaker one day. It was people were interested. And I just find it fascinating. I think partly because I grew up in a very small town. And the reason I bring that up is because I felt like when I grew up in a small town, the city kids always had way more opportunity than the small town kids. Like if you want to learn violin, you'd have to drive to the city, right? You're not learning it, in a small town. Right. You'd have to drive an hour and a half. And so I'm principal in a very small community. And then all of a sudden I'm like speaking at conferences in China, all over Europe, all over South America, and, obviously all over North America. And it really kind of opened my eyes to, there is so much opportunity here. And I created opportunity for myself totally accidentally. That was never my intention. So I want to ensure that I'm helping schools bring these opportunities to kids intentionally. That's something that really matters to me, because I don't want a kid feeling the way I felt when I was a kid, because they shouldn't. They have way more access than I did. But are we leveraging it? Are we saying, no, you have to, kind of follow the footsteps of, of the past. There's new opportunities. And so I think that's why I'm really passionate and adamant about it, because I feel like I do something I truly love that I didn't even know was a thing. And so I want to make sure I really help, communities help their students find that pathway to success for themselves.
Nice. I want to get into the innovation mindset in your book and that conversation.
I just got to I guess I'm done for a second.
Yeah.
You saying nice at the end of that whole thing was a very Canadian thing to do. You're like, nice. I'm like, that is like so Canadian. I loved it. I loved it.
As I said, I
totally
grew up too close to Canada.
I love that. That just made my day. I'm going to tell you that right now.
You had a piece in one of your blogs, and you referenced it as we were talking about a student's online presence. And in your blog, you talk more about like the difference between, hey, I'm going for a job and resume and transcript versus online presence, and where students, like, where are we going as a country? And interestingly, we're in a search right now for a job position. And your example was like, hey, when was the last time you looked at a person's transcript in an education environment? And the answer was like, not. Well, when was the last time you Googled an applicant? Like every one of them. And so I literally in the last couple of days, I get an application, I skim the resume, like, oh, that one looks like probably meets the criteria, get online and start looking. And of course, everything comes up, not just a LinkedIn page. If they've posted, and these are adults that are older, so maybe their online presence is more limited. But for students today coming out of schools, like, they have a huge online presence. That's where they live their lives in many ways. And it's, I have kids. I've got one in college, one in high school, and we already talked to them about, think about what you post, because once it's out there, a future employer might find it. But it also seems like there's a way for us to help kids curate their online presence so that it's an effective tool for them going forward, because they know, or they should know, prospective employers are going to go online and look.
Yeah, and that's been my argument about this whole thing, is that since we know they're going to look, then you should use that to your advantage, because a lot of families and a lot of school communities, they either totally ignore this stuff. And like, I understand. I was actually I remember sitting in a conference, and the superintendent said, hey, we have banned phones from our schools. And we have actually had 0 incidents of cyberbullying since that happened. I'm like, you've had 0 incidents during school time. That's what you've had. You haven't had 0 incidents. You've had 0 incidents during school time, because they don't have access to their phones. But what happens the second the kids leave? And so when they leave and then they start doing that, and a lot of that stuff that happens online, whether you blocked it in school, starts coming back into the school, starts coming back into the school community. So we're trying to be really thoughtful of like, hey, we understand this. I'm not that person who says kids should have phones in their classrooms all the time or anything like that. But when you start banning all of this stuff, then you say like, it's not our problem. We don't pay attention to it. But then we say things like, hey, we got to prepare kids for the real world, or the real world actually Googles you. The real world looks you up. And so when a student is applying for an opportunity and that employer, and this happens with, by the way, and everyone listening to this knows this, whether they admit it or not, you're doing the same thing with teachers, you're doing same thing with staff. You're not like looking at their transcripts because it's like, hey, a lot of great teachers were terrible students, which sometimes makes them a great teacher because they actually understand why students struggle. So this is already happening. The real world actually looks you up, go through, AI searches, go through Google stuff too. And so they're looking at these things. So now there's a story I share, and it is about a student. I actually just saw her on a site called About.me, and it actually had some like highlighted people, right? And one of them was a 17-year-old student at the time. I said, wow, this is like a really great example of someone who's still in high school, has a really good presence. When you find her, you're seeing great stuff. And weirdly enough, when I wrote about her, her teacher followed me on social media in California, right? And so he said, that's my student. And I said, oh, that's so cool. I said, I have a really good story about her. She actually applied to a college and she didn't get in because her grades aren't good enough. So she contacted them and she said to Google me, and then they actually accepted her. And so you're seeing more and more of this doing this stuff. So when families are saying, I don't want my kid to have any presence, or community saying like, we don't want to deal with this stuff, you are basically putting out a blank resume. There is nothing there too. And as I mentioned, we, in our school district years ago, partly through my work and through working with our school board and our superintendents, we actually had an emphasis that kids would actually develop their online presence throughout their entire time. So when they walked out, they had this robust space so that opportunities would find them. And what's interesting, even though I didn't know it existed, like it didn't exist at the time, you're seeing now with ChatGPT, AI searches, the more content that is robust, not actually just, here's links to my stuff, but actually like, here, I'm talking about this topic. I did a podcast on this. Like this podcast between you and I right now is searchable through many AI sites. And so they're not just looking for presence, they're looking for understanding, expertise. So that's starting to shift. So even though we started this, I think 15 years ago, we set our students for an era of ChatGPT, even though we didn't know it was coming. And I think that's what we're trying to do, because we didn't just want them to have like a resume online. We want them to have like information, show their learning, show their progression, how they connect with people, how they communicate. And so that's part of the things that I'm really trying to do with schools, understanding that, there is, as much as I talk about innovation, there's some things I think are really traditional, are really important. I think every kid should be able to read and write. Literacy and numeracy are very essential to the work that we're doing. Also, your character really, really matters. You can be the smartest person in the world, but if you're a jerk to everybody, no one's going to want to work with you. So it doesn't matter. So character is a really important thing. And it's like, I was just I can't remember, I think it was in Maine. One of the school districts said to me, I love how you connect innovation to character and how important that actually is. Because like I said, no one wants to connect with you, no matter how smart you are, if you're just not a good person. So that to me is something that we're really trying to, whether students are online, offline, their character really matters, how they interact with people, even when they disagree with them, I think is a really important point. And so that's something that I'm really trying to emphasize. And I think we're trying to set up our kids not to just prepare them for the real world, but make the real world better and talk about how they can have that connection there as well.
I saw a quote from you, and maybe it was from one of your guests, but it was in one of your blogs, talking about innovation and saying not only to be proactive in response to change, which we talk to our districts about being that way, but also be proactive in creating change. Totally. And I think that that's a struggle because, so many things are coming at districts, and it seems like there's something happening every day that is a fire that has to get put out. And even as an organization, we help to train schools to respond in certain situations and boards to respond in certain situations. Taking that next step to be proactive in creating change, I feel like so many people struggle to say, I don't have the time,
right,
to be proactive in creating change. But at the same time, I could make the argument easily from my seat, not from theirs, that we can't afford not to be proactive in creating change, because as I set up in the lead up to the show, like we are getting criticized because it's a weird place. We're being criticized because we're not doing what is expected from as you said, literacy and numeracy and those type of things. On the flip side, we're also getting pushback to say that we need to go back to the basics, which are those items. So it's like this real push-pull on innovation, but clearly the way that we've been doing it, as the economy in the world has changed, like we still need the outcomes, but the way we're doing it isn't getting the outcomes we want anymore.
Yeah, like when you're talking, I think that's something I've really tried to work on myself to kind of grow in my space, is that when I talk about innovation, it's often the aspirational, right? It's the things that we're trying to get toward. But the thing I'm really trying to work on is making sure people know how, and I even mentioned it here, it's not the basics or innovation, it's how do you build innovation on top of the basics. And the analogy I always give is, if you look at some of the best jazz musicians, why are they considered the best? It's because they have the ability to improvise. They have the ability to create music on the spot. They can like work with another, bandmates, and all of a sudden create this incredible music. The reason they're able to do that is because they know the basics inside out, right? And so I think that's what we're trying to do, is that you're so well versed in the basic skills that every child should actually have, that's when you start really replicating. Like you'll see when I talk, with your group, I'll be reading stuff in the room and really trying to work it in and really kind of bring some of the conversations into my talk instead of just doing the same thing, because I know my stuff inside out, and that really, really matters to me. I have no notes for this. You and I just kind of talk, and I can give you examples off the top of my head, because this is something I live and breathe, because I am like so fundamentally focused on this. But I think as you're talking about, people say they don't have time. I think it's not about adding time. It is about rethinking how you leverage your time. So the example I gave before, how we wanted every student to have a digital portfolio, we weren't saying you have to have, all the things that you're doing plus a digital portfolio. We're like, hey, what are some of the things that we consistently do that we can really kind of really emphasize, but through this online presence these kids are creating. So there's a real big emphasis on that process of kids actually writing consistently. And I remember a parent was pushing back, said like, our kids don't read and write anymore. I'm like, how are you seeing that? And they're like, well, they're always on their blogs, they're always creating stuff. I'm like, they're reading and writing. Do you mean cursive, or do you mean reading and writing? Because kids are reading and writing. And I would actually challenge you that they read more and they actually write more. And they're like, how so? I said, well, because when we actually have these kids post, and they're sharing on stuff, and they're doing this online, they're posting, but then we actually encourage students to comment on each other's stuff. So now instead of writing once and then the teacher responding to every person's thing or post, we actually have our students write once and then comment on 5. So now they're, instead of writing once, they're writing 6 times. And now, because I'm excited I got a comment, I'm responding back to the kids. So now I'm writing 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times. And one of the things we did in our schools, we actually had a thing called digital parent volunteers. So we actually had parents go through what they were doing online. They would actually, they couldn't actually, some of these parents could not actually volunteer in school just because their work day, whatever, but they still want to be a part of their child's, learning experience. So they would actually train to comment on kids' blogs within our school. So you had to take a training to do it. And so each week they would comment to every kid in the classroom. And so the teacher didn't have to do it all of a sudden, but they had to like, hey, don't just say, hey, great job. Because what do you say to that? Right? Thanks. Sure. Hey, I really like this. What about this? So you're trying to get the kid to write more and to go through this process. And what was interesting, I actually remember talking about this and sharing this at a conference I was speaking at. And the next day, a teacher emails me and she said, hey, I love that idea of the digital parent volunteers. Can you lead me to the tutorials that you did for the parents that wanted to volunteer? So I remember she said this about 9 a.m. And then probably about 6 or 7 minutes later, I haven't even seen the email because I'm speaking. She said, hey, don't even worry about it. I just actually realized I'm going to get the kids to make the tutorials for the parents. So the kids in this class, they're grade 3, 4, are like, hey, parents, we can't wait till you write our blogs. Here's some things to be thoughtful of when you're posting online. Anyone can see it. You know, you don't want to say anything mean. And it was like these kids are talking to the adults about how they need to interact and share the process. And some of the parents are like, oh, I am kind of being mean sometimes. So now they're being more thoughtful of this too. And so you're seeing through that process, all of a sudden, kids are reading and writing more than they ever have. Less time for the teachers, because now you're getting more and more kids to write to each other instead of the teacher, right? Like the old practice was 25 kids in a class, 25 journal entries. The teacher takes the 25 books home, writes to every kid. And my argument was like, who's becoming the most literate through the process? The kid that writes once or the teacher that writes 25 times, right? And so we're trying to get them to think differently about this, because you're like, if you look at, I don't know when you went to school, you don't know when I went to school. I do know this. Your time frame was probably 8 to 2:30, 8:30 to 3, 9 to 4, whatever. It does not matter the time that we went to school. The time frame is almost exactly the same, but the demands keep going up. So it doesn't work. It's impossible to say like, hey, we have the same time frame as school day. So it's like really emphasizing you can't add stuff. You have to get people to think differently, and actually to really focus on how do we make learning deeper, teach kids how to connect with each other. And my good friend, A.J. Giuliani, always says this: what are you doing for kids that they could be doing for themselves? And so we shifted some of the communicating to students between each other instead of always just teacher kid.
Yeah, man, I could now, just based on that, your comments there, I could now spend another hour with you to talk about this. And I already had questions that I was going to ask you to begin with. But we're not going to do that. I do want to take a quick break so we can get in a message from one of our sponsors and come back and jump back into the conversation because you've now opened up a lot of other areas for me to talk. So quick message from one of our sponsors and we'll be right back. Welcome back to this episode of My Soundboard. I'm Don Wotruba with MASB, and George Couros, innovation and leadership consultant and speaker at MASB's ALC coming up this fall. George, as I said at the break, you talked about a ton of stuff related to kids in that space. And I'll just put a cap on it for me and, my experience, my kids, their friends. It is interesting to watch kids today, like, because they have, and I know parents sometimes don't like it, but like they have access with that phone to so much information.
Oh,
like, I mean, the ability to be inquisitive and to access information. And I don't care if you are a kid getting D's in class or A's in class, like you're looking stuff up. You have things that are interesting to you that you're finding online, that you're spending a lot of time, more time maybe than what you're spending studying. And it's amazing to me. It's not just a kid watching somebody else play Minecraft. They decide to Google other things and find a YouTube video and they're watching that. And it's about a doctor talking about health issues. It's just amazing to me where kids go, and we have to figure out a way to harness that in our school setting. But I think about the adults in this, right? You just talked about the parent engagement piece, and that is the piece when I think of innovation, and districts all over the country and all over the world go after innovation and innovative ideas and try to move kids in a certain direction. And sometimes it's the parents or the citizens of the community that push back. Mm-hmm. They're coming to the board and saying, we always talk about like new math. It was new math in the 70s. There was new math in the 2000s. And parents are like, that's not how I learn math. Or we get into literacy and they're like, I memorized everything. And like, how do we, like, what do you tell boards and administrators that want to innovate, that have great ideas about better outcomes and ideas that will get to better outcomes, yep, and the parents and communities that push back against it, even though if they spent the time long enough to be in it, they'd see the outcomes are the right ones?
Yeah. And, and you and I were talking about this prior. Part of my work was to work with our school boards in my district role. And so I've had the opportunity to work with school boards all over the world. And it's something I really, really appreciate. And you want to set them up for success. So a lot of my work was not, here's what's coming, right? And scaring them. And, then we get these conversations. It's like, hey, here are some things that we're looking to do. And what we're going to do, we're going to actually teach you. And you're going to go through the process. You're going to learn it. We're not telling you what it is. You're going to go through the process and kind of see some of the opportunities for yourself. So that actually made the boards way more comfortable because they were talking about it from the viewpoint of a learner, not just kind of like hearing it from somewhere and doing this as well. So that really set them up. That was something that was really, really important. And the board that I worked with, in my role, they were so eager, and and they like admittedly struggle, as do I, with a lot of things too. But they knew how important it was that if we were going to kind of move forward and grow, they had to lead by example. And I always say this, that if leading by example is preceded by learning by example. People have to see that you're willing to grow. So we actually took that same philosophy with our families in our community and how important that actually was. So one of the things that I mentioned, some of the portfolio stuff that we were doing, and we didn't just say to, hey, families, hey, guess what? We're putting your kids online. Like, it wasn't a surprise, you can Google your kid now. It was like, hey, here's something we're thinking about. And as we're going through the process, here's some things that we've been doing to prepare for this, kind of do this and learn as the adults. But what we want to do is we want to invite you to actually learn this yourselves and go through that process. And there is a lie we have been telling forever in education, is that so many people believe parents want school to be the way for their kids that it was for them. And that is totally untrue. Parents want what's best for their kids. That's what they want. But if they know nothing else than their experience, they think that's the best experience. So we said, hey, we're going to put you through this process. You're going to go through it. And so what was interesting is our families were so for it, because when the parents came there and we showed them the opportunities, we showed them kind of go through this, and they actually started creating their own portfolios. We had I remember one parent distinctly, she was so adamantly against this. And then she created a portfolio for her pharmacy job, and totally her door started opening up in a totally different way. And she's like, okay, I'm in now. I get it.
Yeah, she saw what the outcome was.
Yeah, so she saw us. And so she was way better versed to kind of not just have her kid come home and talk about, not understand, but she's doing this alongside her child. And so when we had our families walk out of there, they were saying, this is so much better than when I was a kid. And that's what you want. That's what you want too. And so, we are very adamant. When I was a principal, central office, no matter what, we always had families on our professional learning days. We invited parents in. You can't just give an open invitation because, seating, you don't know who's going to show up. But we were very intentional, and we didn't just invite people that we knew would be excited about it. We invited people who we knew were bothered by it. And we said, come, we want you to come and see what we're doing, come go through the process to our teachers. And then I would, as the administrator, say hey, what did you think? What stuck with you? What did you not like? And I wouldn't just disregard and just listen to them and just not do anything with it. Okay, hey, I totally actually understand that. To listen to with the ability to hey, can we change or alter some things based on some of their feedback? Because we don't know everything. And so then we would alter some stuff, and then I represent the parents, hey, based on your feedback, here's some things that we're doing differently. And they would become the biggest advocates for it in a community, because if they weren't, you'd have other families crapping on stuff that the parents helped create. And so they don't want that, right? And it's principals, do you know who they listen to? Other principals, right? Who do teachers listen to? Other teachers. Who do families listen to? Other families. So we said, bring them into the conversation, have them learn through the process, and they will become the biggest advocates. And so that was very intentional, but it was really, I was very proud, because the board was able, that I worked with, was able to answer questions, talk about concerns from a place of experience, not just hearing about it. And so we said, we want to set you up to see some of these things. We don't want to just do this to the kids, but you have no clue what they're doing. We want you to have the opportunity to learn this as well, because we think it's actually essential everywhere. So that was something that really, really mattered to us.
Well, and you in some ways answered out. And as you were talking, I was going to say, one of the other things we often hear is once parents hit their kids hit junior high, like they disengage from the process. They go to parent teacher conferences all through elementary school and then quit. And I was going to ask, like, what are some innovative ways to engage parents that are different than the way I mean, really, parent teacher conferences and classroom volunteers in the elementary spaces, the traditional approach for parent engagement. So, like, for you to throw out there learning things with like what your kids are going to do, invite them in to learn, or I mean, actually having them embedded in some of the professional learning experiences that teachers are taking on as you're maybe launching new ideas within your school district. I mean, that's the first time I've ever heard of that as a possibility. And I just find it fascinating because clearly the way that we've always done it doesn't engage a lot. And you talked about the parent experience is the way that they've always done it. I mean, you didn't even touch on the parent that had a poor experience in school that didn't like it at all.
Yep.
Now they have a kid in school and their predisposition is to be like, it's just not a good place. And so they don't engage because their experience was bad. They don't want to go back into that building again.
Yeah. And that, like, you mentioned parent teacher interviews, and we actually weren't, maybe it's the language, and we were focused on learning conferences. So we didn't we went away from the parent teacher interview process. And so typically what I experienced early in my career is you'd have a 15-minute slot. You'd say here's all the kids, your things your kids doing that's wrong. Here's what's good, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, see it, you just got out the door. So what we really focus on is, we really want the families to come in with their students, and kind of we as the educators are kind of there to, give some comments, questions, but the students would hey, here's this thing I'm working on. I want to talk about this. Here's some things that I want to highlight. And so it was so you could actually see the learning through the child's eyes, and you can see it through that process. And so the parent, and it wasn't it was hey, we're going to have these families come between, 5 and 6. And so then you could be there and you'd answer any questions and things like this too. And so it was really kind of empowering the student to share their learning. But why that was really important is that we didn't want, by the way, we didn't want that to be the first time parents knew what their kids were doing, right? So they would see stuff that was going on. That's why we wanted kids to create these spaces where they're sharing their learning consistently, in spaces that parents had access to. But then they would also, you really empower the kid to take ownership over their learning after school, right? If you think about this process, the old school process, and I'm not against old school anything, right? But I'm against stuff that we used to do that doesn't necessarily work. It is you'd have the person, a teacher, say your kid needs to fix this, or they're good at this, whatever. And the kid's voice is totally left out of the process. We wanted the kid to be able to really feel comfortable sharing, this is what I'm learning, because at some point they're gonna have to do that when they're out of school. And so, because that's not a thing we do later in life. And that was really important to us. So it really shifted some of the conversations, and you could kind of see their learning from the students' eyes. But families were, as you said, there's a lot of parents that they didn't like school the way it was. And so now they're seeing something very different in how we're trying to connect with families, but also seeing their kids' experience. They're I didn't like it, but I might have liked this. And that's what we're trying to kind of emulate through that process.
Well, and a kid in that situation, right? If you're not a part of parent-teacher conferences, as a student, which the old model you typically were not, but now if I am going to be a part of it and I have to talk to my parents about what I've learned or what I'm doing, then I guess I actually have to be doing something in the class to be able to share with my parents, because it's one thing to walk home and how was school today and be fine, and that's as far as it goes. But now I actually have to talk to my parents about something that's going on. It creates an accountability for the student as well that, puts them in a place to I won't say be forced to learn, but to understand that
their responsibility.
Yes, absolutely.
Their responsibility through the process, right? They have to, when they're actually owning that process and doing that too, there, as you said, there is an accountability to actually have something done. And I think this is something, we've talked about in education, is that is it all the burden on the teacher to show what the kid has learned? Then, the kid might not even care, but it's hey, you actually, So what are you gonna show your family tonight? Like, what are some of the things that you want to highlight? What are some things that, because you're actually leading the conversation? It's like, oh, like now I have to do something now, right? So that's a really important point they made, that is shifting that too, and that's what we ultimately want. Like, my big thing is, if kids walk out of school and they still need the teacher, you haven't done your job. You want them to get in a point where they don't need us anymore, right? You don't want them like, man, I need to go back to high school because I don't know how to figure this stuff out anymore.
Yeah, because then they're not prepared, and that's what we're trying to do for them. I hate to bring in a conversation about innovation and doing things differently. Like, and I don't want to make it about technology, but it's pretty hard to ignore AI and what it's the last 18 months, or well, now almost 2 years since ChatGPT launched. But what do you think? And I know, yes, AI is innovative in the tech space and in the kind of how do we find information space. But do you think that AI is going to be a catalyst for innovation in the classroom?
I like it's going to change a bunch of things for sure, right? And I think we have to, the thing that I think is happening in schools, and I know this is weird, it's going a little too quickly. We are so focused on what are we doing with kids with this stuff, and I think it's actually the wrong place to start. The first thing we need to focus on is like, what are we doing for ourselves with this stuff? How do we actually navigate this? How do you teach something that you've never learned, right? And so that's something that really, really matters. So I actually, I'm really trying to emphasize this on, like, hey, is this valuable to you? Do you see the value to this process? So I actually remember I'm in Atlanta and I'm working with a group of gifted teachers. And this is typically the room wherever I go. So 50% of these teachers are, you know what, we need to kind of figure this AI stuff out because it's here. Like, there's nothing we can do about it. And 50% are like, over my dead body, are you ever, we're doing this stuff. Like, you're going to get kids that are dumber and they can't think for themselves. So they're kind of, it's kind of like a split room. And, whether it's 50-50, 60-40, that's what the rooms are right now. So, we didn't mention this. I actually did move to the US about 3 years ago from Canada, and I'm working with this group, and I just kind of throw it as a side that, I'm new to the country. You have some different investing things here. You have like 401ks, Roth IRAs, all these different things that I'm not familiar with. In Canada, we had like two. We had like what's called a TFSA and RSP. So it's pretty, and then your tax structure is very different because like state, federal, and all this other stuff. So I'm like having a really hard time understanding this. And I probably would like to retire within 10 years, so I can, if I want to work, I can, but do I have the ability? So I want to have a certain amount of income through this process. So I'm like talking to these advisors, but they're pretty expensive. So I'm a little bit nervous about this. But then I'm like, why would I'm going to just throw in ChatGPT. So I said, hey, I'm self-employed. I want to retire with this amount of money. What are some tax incentivized ways that I can invest? And it was really interesting. I threw it in ChatGPT and it just gave me a plan. I was like, oh, and it explained, and I'm like, okay, explain this to me. So it gives me a plan. So what happens in this room when I say this, and I'm just kind of throwing off, like, off the cuff, which is very intentional. The next 30 minutes, not one teacher listened to anything I had to say because they all popped open their computers. They're all like figuring out how they retire in 10 years and going through the process. And that was the intent. It was like, because, I'm not retiring in 10 years, right? That's not happening. But I knew a bunch of them were. They're like, yeah, what do I do? And so all of a sudden, it wasn't, this is how kids cheat on essays. It was like, oh, and that's a shift. If an adult sees it's as valuable to them, they're more likely to teach it their kids. But if they don't, see any value of it, then it's just going to be the conversation like, we shouldn't be using this, blah, blah, blah. But it was like interesting because it shifted the room immediately because I wanted them to see value for themselves. And so I wasn't even talking about this. Then we started getting into student stuff because they were like, yeah, we got to teach this to kids because like, I want to retire here. So like, I don't want kids to be in the same situation where I'm like worried about it.
Yeah, I was just in a presentation and it was more in that education space, but I was the presenter and we were talking, how do you engage teachers in the AI conversation? Yeah. And He gave an example of a school district that they were doing some work in, and they completely like purposefully didn't talk about kids. They
Totally.
talked about the tools that teachers could use
Yep.
to make their lives in the classroom, but their lives as a teacher
Yep.
more efficient, more productive, easier, taking some of those tasks that are time consuming that teachers hate, and how do we make that easier for them? And he's like, of course, in that space, then, as some people that were in the room were similar, right? I am not interested in doing any of this. He was talking about how is it going to help you
Yep.
do you, and not about teaching at all. And he's like, you could see the shift in the room amongst, because it was about helping teachers do those things that they didn't want to do, that that they have to do, and it made life easier. And it was also talking about things that could be used as tools to help teach kids, but they weren't getting into that space. It was all about what tools were out there for teachers, and that really helped to engage them. Then they might more easily take new tools and use them with the students themselves.
Yeah, now that's like I wrote about this probably two and a half, like probably a couple months after ChatGPT really kind of hit the scene. I said basically what you need to do in this order is like, you want people talking about the negatives. What is the fear? What is this? What is the negative of this? Give them time to vent. Like say like, hey, we're gonna have Terminator 2. Like that's happening right now. But then let's say, what are some of the opportunities? And it is very intentional. I want you to kind of go down and then go up. I don't want you to like talk about the positives and then go down, because then we get into the space. And then the next one is like, okay, how does this benefit me personally? So like the financial one, obvious one that I just shared, but I also like, I run quite a bit and I do marathon training. I have like very tailored plans based on like what I'm trying to do, like what my schedule this week. Cause like if you go on, it's like, hey, here's your week, Monday to Sunday for running. But I'm like, hey, I'm not able to, I'm traveling on Tuesday. So then it like tailors stuff to me. So, my wife does like keto diet. She like says, hey, what should I eat? Give me a grocery list, blah, blah, blah. So now I'm seeing the personal benefits. Then we get to how does this help me in my work? And they start identifying some of that stuff. And then we go to kids. And so that process is very intentional. But a lot of schools, they're just going to the kids. And then you're going to the reverse space where, well, this is the worst. You shouldn't be doing this. And it's like, no, like actually give people time to like kind of go through this process and see this as well. And I think anytime you're using it in education to actually really kind of benefit you, you should actually be sharing that process with your students. So you shouldn't be getting on kids for using, ChatGPT to write essays if you're grading all their essays with ChatGPT, right? Like,
Yeah, right.
that to me. So I'm not saying kids should be writing their essays with ChatGPT. And even like I teach a class with UPenn. It's a graduate level course. And I always said, listen, AI is everywhere. And I actually think you should use it. Reference it. When you use it, I want you to reference it. So it's all of a sudden the stigma is off of it, and I'm not worried about them cheating. I'm like giving them permission. Like, so now I can tell what your work and whatever. So just tell me when it's something that you leverage AI with. And so that really kind of made people think differently about like, hey, like instead of telling kids not to use it, encouraging kids identify when you do, and how does that actually make you think deeper, and how does that actually improve your work. So that's a process. I'm always trying to get the adults to kind of go first through this process. Like you mentioned, I have a podcast. The only reason I have a podcast is I'm like, is podcasting beneficial to students? Well, I'm not going to know unless I start my own. So then I started doing this, I did this in 2020, not because of COVID, because COVID happened a few months later. But yeah, I was like, I wanted to understand it. And this is something, and now I use like AI with editing, kind of helping with the descriptions, tags, all this other stuff. And, part of my progression is just constantly learning, and whatever comes my way, I'll figure it out. That's because that's my mentality.
Yeah. Well, George, I have to say, we already went past our half an hour by probably 10 minutes or more, which is just fine because the conversation's been great. And actually now I'm more excited to see your
Awesome.
speech at the conference. But I have to pull the plug and be like, hey, we need to stop here. And I didn't get to many of the conversation topics that I wanted to touch base with on, but I think for people listening, like I said, it should pique you to want to go to our conference and hear George in person, or go to his website and look up things, because I could have sat here for 2 hours, and I think people probably could have listened to 2 hour long podcast in this case.
Yeah, well, Don, and one of the things I want to share, like I'll share some ideas, share some thinking, but I am doing a breakout session at the conference as well. And the way that I do the breakout session, it's very conversational, and it's meant to be like, what do you need, and figure this out. It's not like a mini keynote in a side room. It is like conversational. But one of the things that I am really adamant about, I'll actually figure out what people want to do, leveraging AI to actually get some of their information, give them time to reflect, give them time to process. And I'm not doing it in the background. They'll see me do it right in front of them. So they're like, oh, and I think that's where a lot of things shift. So I'm really excited to join you all, because I know this is a big conversation, but I want people to feel really ready to, lead their communities, feel well equipped to do this from that place of experience and that place of learning, because I think that's the best way we lead our schools.
Well, I want to say thank you very much for joining us on the show today. Really appreciate it. I want to thank everybody out there for listening to today's show, and say that that's all the time that we have for this edition of My Soundboard.